I spoke about the Venus star point. So this is somewhat of an eclipse. Eclipses, are a new moon or a full moon on the nodes. But right before the eclipse occurs on October 25th, there is a very, very powerful and unique event. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ariel Gutman's research on the Venus star point, Venus cycle. It's particularly important to us this period of time because there's something unusual, there's something new happening with this alignment with the Venus cycle. But it's also very important because the eclipses are in Taurus and Scorpio, and Venus rules Taurus. So we need to pay attention to Mars and Pluto from the Scorpio side, and we need to pay attention to Venus. So if you're not familiar with the Venus star point, there's quite a bit of videos. Again, you can look on YouTube, and you can, of course, get Ariel Gutman's book. What this consists of, basically, is that Venus conjuncts the Sun every 9 months, one time direct, one time retrograde. And it creates a 5-pointed star pattern through these conjunction. And because Venus's orbit is relatively regular, we'll call it, it's not eccentric, it's not elliptic, it has almost no eccentricity. So this pattern is pretty harmonious and pretty consistent. It keeps repeating over and over. So these are the meeting points where Venus meets the Sun. And so that's one of the key moments in the Venus cycle. Every time a planet conjuncts the Sun, it receives a blessing from the king, if you will. There's something very dramatic about this activation. So this star pattern is the one that occurs when Venus is direct. So all these conjunctions, the next one is October 22nd, and then the following one will be June 2024, and then January 2026. So you follow the numbers, and it creates this star pattern over and over again. So these degrees become the pillars of the Venus influence. If you have a planet on those degrees, or an angle, or something important in your chart, these become part of the star pattern, and they receive that Venusian energy. So imagine the Sun and Venus together. It's an energy that's very, immediately connected to the heart chakra. It's about appreciation. It's about generosity. It is about love, in its highest form. There's definitely an energy of love and an energy of unification, but also creativity. So this star pattern is not only important the day it occurs, it is important for a whole period of time. Now, what is so unique about the upcoming one? As you see, it's going to be at 29 Libra. And that star pattern, even though it keeps repeating, it takes 8 years for a whole star to be created through these conjunctions. every time it repeats, it moves 1 degree back, 1 to 2 degrees back. So it's slightly over time retrogrades, from 16 Capricorn to 15 Capricorn to 14 to 13, etc. So what we're seeing here is that it's the first time that a star pattern is occurring in the sign of Libra. It has been in Scorpio for how long? If we say it takes 8 years to complete one star, and there are 30 degrees, it takes a century or more to go through one full sign. So the last time one of the star patterns was in Libra was in the 1800s. And the interesting thing, since it's moving back, is that the Aries star pattern is also moving back and edging into Pisces. So we're moving from Scorpio Aries, which are very Martian signs, to Libra Pisces, which are very Venusian signs. And so Venus is going to be, spending centuries in its cycle in signs where it is, I would say, amplified. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, so we don't use exaltation and detriment and terms that are overly deterministic. But there's definitely, an amplification of the Venus paradigm in those signs. Now, the interesting thing that is happening during that time is we can all, like we say, I'm leading this workshop in Mexico. I encourage everyone, whether you join or not, even if you stay at home, to ceremoniously acknowledge, connect with this energy. Don't let it just be a day that passes you by. If you have a planet on those degrees, of course, it becomes even more personal and important. But, celebrate Venus on the 22nd and celebrate the fact that there's a new era in Libra. And we are now, in the thick of a very ugly conflict in Europe. So it's interesting that there's a lot of things happening in air signs. The Venus moving into Libra, Mars is going to retrograde in Gemini. The retrograde Mercuries have all happened in air signs in the course of 2022. So it's no surprise with all these air activation that the two leaders, involved in this war, Putin and Zelensky, are both air signs, sun. So Putin is a Libra sun, Saturn, Neptune, and Zelensky is himself born on a Venus star point in Aquarius. I'm going to show his chart here. So just a glance, this is Zelensky's chart. You see he's born on a Venus-Sun conjunction in Aquarius. So this Venus star point become meaningful. But that's for later. Let's continue. So,
sorry, Maurice, we have a few orb questions coming in, which if you'd mind to take.
Sure.
Someone's asking here, what type of orb are you using when aspecting the Venus star point?
Well, I will say it depends what you're looking at. If you're looking at, a conjunction to a natal planet, I would use a tight orb of 1 to 2 degrees. But if we're looking at at the cycle from a more collective point of view, you can use wider orb. For example, the star point is now at 29 Libra, and it's going to retrograde gradually into the early degrees of Libra. So even if you have a planet at 20 Libra, you'll be under this influence for several years. So it depends, if you're looking at a specific, what's going to happen on October 22nd, then I'm going to use a tight orb. But if you're looking at a more global era, then I would, go to 10 or 12 degrees.
Thank you.
So what you will notice is that a lot of global, themes are going to be activated around those degrees. For example, it happens to be that Charles was inaugurated as king. It was officially, the ceremonial process was officially activated and confirmed when the ascendant was 29 Libra. Things like that, even ahead of time. Now, what's interesting is that the Sun and Venus are conjunct at 29 exactly, but then as they move forward slowly, they stay together for a few days. And so on the day of the eclipse, which is on October 25th, they're still conjunct. Venus is starting to move away because Venus moves a little faster than the Sun. But during the exact conjunction of the Sun and Moon, Venus is right there. So what's really powerful is that not only do we have an eclipse, but there's an exact, a conjunction of visitor or a special guest to this eclipse, which is Venus. So this Venus star point activation is going to bleed into the eclipse. And that's what I mean by, Venus is the ruler of the North Node in Taurus. It's the ruler of the lunar eclipse that follows. You need to pay attention to the Venusian themes of economy, relationships, resource management, all these things. Now, just taking you back to that Mexico event, what is interesting in the Mexican tradition, we speak about the Day of the Dead and honoring the departed. But one of the things that is custom in the Day of the Dead is that not only do you bring photographs of your loved ones who transition, but you want to cook their best meal. You want to really express your love through food. How Taurian is that? So there's something about that celebration that brings the immateriality of Scorpio with the material quality, the food, the body, the senses, the smells, the colors, the art of Taurus and Venus. We see that also, with the Egyptian rituals where they buried their kings, with all their possessions, so they could enjoy their possessions in the afterlife, in the other dimensions. So there's something about the Taurus Scorpio axis that has to do with the, that tie between spirit and matter, between the material dimension and the spiritual dimension. Scorpio obviously speaks about reincarnation, about the shadows of the unknown, these endings. Are they real endings? What is death really? And then Taurus speaks about how do we live well here, in our bodies? How do I soul are integrated in our bodies. Another theme associated with this axis is sexuality. Both Scorpio and Taurus relate to sexuality, but both capture sexuality in a very, very different way. From a scorpionic point of view, sexuality has to do with the emotional connection, with the need to fuse with your partner, the eye to eye, the soulful connection, sometimes emotionally possessive when it's not handled properly, can become overbearing. But at its core, Scorpio use of sexuality is for the purpose of fusion. 2 and 2 equal 1 and 1 equals 1 from a Scorpio point of view. This is something we're also going to talk in our relationship workshop that I will be leading online. Whereas Taurus represents the more physical aspect of sexuality, the need to connect to your body, the need to experience physical pleasure. Just the same way you enjoy a meal, the same way you smell the aromas. Sexuality is a sensual experience that makes you feel good. And from a spiritual point of view, it has to do with integrating the soul into the physical body so that the soul won't feel trapped in the body, so it doesn't feel caged. Is your heart caged by your ribs? And the purpose of Taurus is to make us understand that the body is a temple, not a cage. The body is, celebrating the spirit, holding the spirit rather than choking it. So the use of sexuality from a Taurian point of view is to integrate spirit into body, into flesh. And of course, many religious traditions have disconnected sexuality from spirituality. And so these eclipses can be very, very powerful in that respect. Now, when we look, the first one, as we see, is a Scorpio eclipse conjunct Venus, and it's a very important degree to Scorpio. Is considered a degree that the moon is a little weakened. We're going to wait and see. I personally don't want to project negative or positive bias. I want to, first of all, understand what the eclipses are about, and then, we can look at the potential shadow work and shadow side versus the virtues. But let's look at the other eclipse. We have each time at least two eclipses together, a solar and a lunar. So a solar eclipse is a new moon close to the nodes. So here it's 2 degrees. And the lunar eclipse is a full moon, sun opposing moon, close to the nodes. So what we see is that the lunar eclipse is going to be at 16 Taurus. And guess what? We have another guest. 2 guests. Uranus conjuncts the moon pretty tightly, and Mercury conjuncts the sun pretty tightly. So the second eclipse includes a Uranus-Mercury conjunction, opposition, activation in those signs. So what's really interesting, Mercury and Uranus are very mental planets. They have to do with the mind and the higher mind and inventions and logistics and technology, whereas the Venus, moon, sun energy is much more heart related. It's more emotional. So that's just something to keep in mind as we look at these two eclipses. And I'm going to come back to them. But just remember that it's a big deal. We have like 5 planets involved in this eclipse. Now, one thing you want to pay attention to, and we're going to look at it, is that the closer the eclipse, the new moon or the full moon, is to the nodes, the more total it will be, the more, the disk is going to be covered. So the first eclipse is 11 degrees away from the nodes, which means it's not that close. It's not going to be a total eclipse. It's going to be a partial eclipse. Whereas the lunar eclipse is only 3 degrees from the nodes. So it's much closer to the nodes. And we do, know that it's going to be a total eclipse. So the proximity to the nodes will determine whether it's partial or total. Now, that's astronomy. In my experience, whether the eclipse is partial or total doesn't make it better or worse, doesn't make it less powerful or more powerful. I've seen partial eclipses, cause major changes. So that's my experience. It's not set in stone, but that's what I've observed, is that you should not underestimate a partial eclipse. So let's look, into what this all is or mean. Eclipses are a new moon. It's going to be a solar or a full moon on the nodes. We just said that. But what I want you to also understand is that we need to look at the whole period of time, what we call a season. So looking back at the chart, there are going to be at least 2 pairs of eclipses. There's a solar lunar eclipse on the south node and a solar lunar eclipse on the north node. So obviously, when the sun is in Scorpio this year, we have the eclipses. And earlier in April and May, when the sun was in Taurus, we had our 2 other eclipses. Next year, the nodes are going to move to Aries Libra. So the eclipses will take place in Aries Libra when the sun is on those nodes. With an orb, we talked about the orbs. So what you're going to look at is that as soon as the sun is about 12 to 15 degrees, some may even be more generous than that. Some may even say 20 degrees approaching the node, you're going to enter what we call eclipse season. So I'm going to illustrate that. So this is today. You see the sun. The sun is in Libra. Nodes are in Scorpio, and the moon in Sag. And so we move day by day, and you start to see the sun getting closer and closer to the nodes. We had our full moon on October 9. Then we continue, and even before the moon reaches the sun, as it gets to about 20 degrees away from the node, we start to enter that zone that is called the eclipse season. So every person that is born with a sun close to any nodes is going to be born during an eclipse season, even if it's not the exact eclipse day. And there, we approach it more and more. And as we know, that's October 25th is the actual conjunction. I'm going to move my, oops. This is the exact eclipse day. And then we continue. The sun is still close to the nodes during this time. 2 weeks later, the full moon is the lunar eclipse. And then the moon moves off, and the sun is still close to the nodes. And some may say that we can consider this on October 23rd, we have another sun-moon conjunction that is 18 degrees away from the nodes. So it's a really mini eclipse. It's barely going to overshadow each other. But it is within orb because solar eclipse can go up to 18 degrees. But even if there wasn't an eclipse, the fact that the sun is still within 15, 20 degrees from the nodes, you're still in the season. And so everything that you may experience about eclipses can be experienced during the whole season. So it's actually a period of 30 days to up to 40 days. The closer it gets, obviously, to the nodes, the stronger it will be. Now, what do you also notice here? Let's go back a month and even 2 months. Look at the degrees of the nodes. When you use true nodes, there are 2 ways to measure the nodes, the mean node and the true node. This is the true node. And you see the sun moving closer and closer to the nodes. See what happens to the degree of the nodes. It freezes. So it stays on that 13 degrees the whole time the sun is conjunct the nodes. As soon as the sun moves off, the nodes begin to retrograde. And they move much faster back. So what happens during eclipses is that the nodes are freezing for 6 weeks. And so the degree of the nodes becomes as important as the degree of the eclipse. So you see here next spring in the north, March 2023, the sun approaches the nodes again, and there it is. They freeze at 4 for Taurus Scorpio. And then we have a lunar and a solar eclipse, and the nodes remain at 4. And then as soon as the sun moves off, they start to retrograde more rapidly. So that's one of the reasons why I feel that using the true nodes is really important, because you won't see that phenomenon with the mean nodes. So what is eclipse season? What happens? Think about the time that the sun comes close to the nodes. This is a diagram of what the nodes mean. The orbit of the sun, it's called the ecliptic, is the purple line. And the orbit of the moon is the yellow line. So the moon is about 5 degrees maximum, swinging north and south of the sun. And so the moon crosses the sun path twice every month. You know, it takes a month for a moon, as Gemini Brett would say. It takes about a month for the moon to complete its orbit. So when it conjuncts the north node, it's going to be here. When it conjuncts the south node, it's going to be here on that point of intersection. This means that during the time that both the sun and the moon are on these intersection points, everything is perfectly aligned. Everything is on the same level. And that's why they hide each other. If we have, that's also the reason why we don't have an eclipse every full moon and every new moon, because if the eclipse occurs when the moon is up here, then there's a gap that doesn't allow the eclipse to fully occur. So the closer the eclipse is to the node, the more the effect of covering each other will occur. So let's go back to our illustration here. Look at the moon only now. So the moon here on the 21st of June is squaring the nodes, and then on June 28, it's conjunct the nodes. So what you can do, June 21, 2023, it's approximate, right? That's when we said that the moon is squaring the nodes. I'm going to look at the declinations and the latitude. So you see, latitude is how far the planet, how north and south is the planet from the ecliptic, from the sun path. And you see that when the moon squares the node, it's at maximum. It's at 5 degrees north. Then a week later, that was June 28, 2023. And we're going to only look at the sun and moon. So here, the date that this moon is on the nodes, you look at the latitude and you see here the latitude is almost 0. You know, it's not exactly 0 because it's a few degrees off. So when the moon is on the node, it's at 0 latitude because it's on the sun path. When the moon squares the node, it's at maximum distance. And you see that in this graph. What am I basically saying is, that's the reason why we don't have eclipses on every new moon and full moon, but it's also the reason why eclipses are so powerful, because it's that perfect alignment. So during the time that the sun is close to the nodes in this part of its cycle, we enter a time where everything is intensified. That eclipse season is going to be a time where our experience of time is not linear anymore. It creates this effect of being almost as, I would use strong words, but it's almost as if we enter another dimension. And if the gates to other dimension become more thinner and more accessible. And so that's just the sun close to the nodal point. But then when the moon is exactly there as well, the gates are open. So it's like this portal to other realms. It sounds very mystical. What does that mean on a day-to-day level? A few things people can experience during eclipses is that it's a time for divine intervention. It's a time where our ego is not so much in control anymore. It's a time where fate has a stronger influence. So when the sun's away from the node and we're out of the season, you're in your routine and you're leading your life the way you planned it, and you're basically exercising your free will. But then as the sun comes close to the node and that portal opens, and then the moon is the actual lock opening, there's something of a higher order happening. And this is why during eclipses, what many can experience is a time where everything happens very rapidly. Change occurs very rapidly. Things come to a head. The way I like to explain it or to illustrate it is when you look at a series on TV and you have, 10 episodes, and it's building up through the episode. And then you have the final episode, the closing of the series, and everything comes to a climax, and all the issues come to a head, and everything is extremely dramatic. That's kind of the eclipse season, that last closing episode that intensifies everything. And so that is also why, if you look culturally, obviously there were many different myths associated with the eclipse, because they were looking at the sun, and the sun is disappearing. They were looking at the moon, it's turning red, it's weird, it's dangerous. What does it mean? And so you had all kinds of rituals trying to participate in this event or trying to appease the gods. And interestingly, the Norse saw that eclipse as a wolf eating the sun. And it's interesting that the moon is definitely related to the wolf, whereas the sun is related to the feline. So that's kind of an interesting imagery. But I would say, the Aboriginal Australian, the sun was seen as a woman who carries a torch. The moon, by contrast, was regarded as male. Because of the association of the lunar cycle with the menstrual cycle, the moon was linked with fertility. So a solar eclipse was interpreted as a moon man uniting with a sun woman. And I'm not going to dwell on the gender association. Several cultures see the sun as feminine, and so it really varies. But however you look at it, there is a marriage. There is some kind of intimate connection between those two very personal, very important markers in the sky. And to me, it's nothing to fear, but the same way, you're not looking at the sun because the light, there's no light suddenly during a solar eclipse. It's not something to fear, but it is something that tells us that it's a private audience between the sun and the moon. And this is why you as a mortal, don't have full control during that time. There's something of a higher order. The same thing happens when other planets conjunct the sun. We talk about the Venus star point. So when Venus is conjunct the sun during those star points, you don't see Venus. She's not visible because you're blinded by the sun. Only when she's about 10 degrees away from the sun do you start to see her in the morning or the evening. So I wouldn't interpret that as something bad because you can't see her. I would simply say There's something that happens during this between the sun and Venus that's none of your business. So it's basically something of a higher order where us humans need to kind of wait and see as they deliberate, as they are in session. And then as Venus reappears, we can have our action, a decision, and follow our course. So the fact that our ego, cannot see, eyes, relate to the ego, relate to the sun. The fact that we don't see them doesn't mean it's good or bad. It simply means it's beyond you. You're not invited to that party. Anyway, so during eclipse season, we can anticipate things to move really quickly, for change to occur very rapidly in almost like a fated way, and it can change our lives sometimes radically. There's also an ancient saying that kings, queens are born and die during eclipses, that during those portal openings, there's a lot of transition of souls. Now, I will extend that to say that people who are born during eclipses have a strong sense of destiny. They feel like they come here on a mission. There's a greater sense of importance to their incarnation. So it's not necessarily kings and queens, but it's because many people are born during those times, but it does amplify leadership, purpose, something to carry forward. Sometimes, because the eclipses represent something of a higher order, something that's fated, it can be overwhelming. It's an energy that, again, can be more intense to process. And the question is it good? Is it bad? I will say it could be either. And I mean good or bad as in, is it a loss? Is it something that causes grief? Is it something that is taken away from you? Or is it a reward and some kind of a harvest of your effort? It's a change. Last eclipse in Taurus, that's when I decided to step down from the leadership of OPA. So it was the exact eclipse, and we were in Tucson during the conference. And, it's not like I said, oh, it's an eclipse, that's when I'm going to say it. It just happened organically that because we were there during that time and because everyone was present, it was just the logistical right time to talk about it and to announce it. But it happened to be an eclipse. So I was kind of eclipsed from the organization, but it wasn't a bad thing. It was just time for me to leave. It was time for me to, change and move to do other things. It's interesting that was it 2014, 8 years prior, is when I was elected president of OPA, which means that during the week of the eclipse in 2014, I was elected to the leadership, and that eclipse occurred in my 10th house. And so that was a very empowering moment. It happened very rapidly. There was a change of leadership, and they were looking for someone, to take over. It was not a process that was planned long before. It really happened quite spontaneously. And almost out of the blue, I found myself leading the organization. And then, the 8 years later, the following 8 years later in the same spring, I decided to step down, to leave. And so Eclipse definitely have a thread. You can track the different activation over the years. And that's what we're going to do in our workshop in November, the fuller immersion, look at charts more. Now, it is true that some people, souls who feel that they are done, will choose the eclipse season to exit. It is a time, I won't have statistical numbers. It's not something I've measured, but it is quite prominent to see that there is more departures and births, like suddenly people getting more pregnant during the eclipse season. And I want to give this example. This is a man who was in his early 70s. And so he was not born during an eclipse, though his sun was close to the North Node at birth. So he was born during eclipse season, the beginning of an eclipse season. And during this whole time, as a good Leo, he liked good food, he lived well. And so he had a lot of liver and heart problems from the excesses. But he was doing rather well. And then came an eclipse, which happened to be a nodal return. So the nodes return to the same position, and there's an eclipse exact on the south node. And in the space of 2 days, his health deteriorated and he transitioned in, like we say, the eye of the storm. Sun, moon were exact. So it does happen. Now, the legend about the kings and queens, interestingly, Prince William in England was born on a solar eclipse, new moon on the North Node, while his wife was born on a lunar eclipse, full moon on the node. So they're born 6 months apart with the nodes in Cancer Capricorn, and she's born, with a Cancer lunar eclipse. He's born on the Cancer solar eclipse. And so, you look at that and you say, of course, they're meant to be together. And you look at that and you say, of course, he's going to be king one day. It's the chart, like it's so prominent, like his sun is on the angles, opposing Neptune, which has to do with public service. It's an eclipse. But look at that. The October 25 eclipse is exact on his MC. Interesting. We know that the queen passed, but she passed in September. That's way before the eclipse. Well, you will notice that eclipses start to vibrate, to work ahead of time. And how long ahead of time? Sometimes months. We know that sometimes the eclipse can still be very potent months after it occurs. But I would like you to pay attention to the times before. I've seen over and over very important activations ahead of eclipses that were relevant to that eclipse. So it's undeniable. We can all agree that this is kind of an important, position. It's angular. It's on his MC, and he's, by through the passing of the Queen Mother, he is elevated to a higher status, which is all MC stuff. On her end, Kate has the eclipse on her IC, because they have the exact opposite MC IC. And so, yeah, her family life, is affected. You look at Charles, who became king, a few weeks ago. The eclipses are in Scorpio, Taurus. His mother, who passed, is a 0 Taurus sun. The child is a 0 Taurus moon, and his nodes are on these early Scorpio degrees. The eclipse occurs on his nodes, opposing his moon, 2-3 months ahead of the actual event. And he becomes the king. So Scorpios and Tauruses, are obviously more personally affected. And that, of course, not only applies to the sun signs, but to any part of your chart that has an abundance of Scorpio Taurus energy. So, it's not a coincidence that there's kind of a rite of passage, a rotation in the family where the Taurus and Scorpios are involved. Now, what I want to stress out is that it can bring very, very beneficial things, the same way that it can take things away from us. The way I like to describe it is eclipses are a time where things happen rapidly and you're blindfolded because the light is removed. And stuff happens and you don't exactly know what happens. But then when you remove whatever was covering your eyes, you suddenly see that the room looks different. Reality has changed. And I'm going to show you another interesting example here. This is a lady, a client, who was born, guess when? Sun on the North Node during eclipse season. The moon was not on the nodes. The moon was squaring the nodes. So she was born right between a solar and a lunar eclipse. A week prior, there was a solar eclipse on the North Node. And the week after, there was a full moon lunar eclipse. So she was born right in the middle. That's how important the whole season is. Now, as you can see, her 5th house is quite loaded. And that moon is sandwiched between the Mars and the Plutos and the Uranus, opposing Saturn. And what happens is that she's trying to get pregnant and she finds out she can't. She's not able to biologically conceive. And so she starts procedures for adoption. And the way it works is that, they evolve the rules where the parent who wants to adopt can be in touch with the parent who will give away the child, so that the parents can choose who the adoptive parent is going to be for their child. So they create this reality where it's not so impersonal, where there's some kind of connection, a thread between the biological parent and the adoptive parent. So she was basically meeting women who were pregnant and who could not keep their child. But it's a process that is like it's almost like a gamble. You don't know if you're going to be chosen. You don't know how long it's going to take. You keep meeting mothers and having hopes, and it's you're not in control. And then, bang, an eclipse occurs. A lunar eclipse occurs exactly on her ascendant. And that night, she gets the phone call that one of the mothers that she was in touch with gave birth, and she was selected to be the adoptive mother. And so overnight, she became a mom. Now, this example is so eclipse themed because that kind of overnight change where your reality is suddenly shifting completely, something happens that takes a twist, 90-degree turn in your life, and you're basically starting anew. And it's, in her case, a very joyful event. And you can imagine that since the baby is born during that eclipse and it's right on the adoptive mom's ascendant, that her connection with that child is very, very deep, and they really get along very well. So, there's a very deep, soulful connection. And so what I want to highlight is that, yes, things can happen suddenly. Yes, it can, you can feel that things are accelerated during eclipses, but it may be a time where what you've been waiting for finally happens. How many times I see people who, for example, put their house on the market and it doesn't sell, and they wait and wait. And then when an eclipse occurs at a strategic point in their chart, out of the blue, they get the phone call, someone wants it. And, suddenly things fall into place. Like, it's, again, everything lines up, just like the sun, moon, earth are lining up. Everything lines up for the sale to unfold. So it can be that things that have been postponed, that have taken a lot of time, that you even sometimes forgot about, are suddenly quickly resolved or activated during the eclipse. And again, it could also mean that you felt comfortable in your job, you felt that you were, in charge of your life, and suddenly, the eclipse comes and they're firing you. And you suddenly have to reinvent yourself. Now, we are now also in a Mars retrograde period. You can see a video I did on Mars retrograde in my YouTube channel. And one of the things I mentioned is that Mars retrograde has a lot to do also with reinventing ourselves, has a lot to do with changing the course of our lives, of direction. So the combination of Mars going retrograde with the eclipses, we can anticipate a lot of twists and turns. Another quick example, this is a woman who had a reverse nodal return. You see, she's born with the nodes 19 Scorpio North Node. And when the nodes were reversed and the lunar eclipse occurred in her fourth house, she decided in the space of a few weeks to relocate. She was living with her brother at a time, Mercury, on the nodes, and she, he needed to, something was happening with his business. He wanted to move to Europe. And she basically felt like, okay, this is the time it has to happen. And the lunar eclipse occurred in her 4th, 10th house. So 4th house has to do with our home, where we're going to live. And so it happened that she changed states. She moved to another state. Another thing I would like to bring up is looking ahead into future eclipses. We're looking at one coming up, but there's one in 2023, next year, October 2023, and then a following one, April 2024, whose passage is going to be over the United States. Interestingly, Texas is the intersection of these two eclipses. Now, does it matter if you live on the path of the eclipse? Does it mean it's going to be stronger if you live in those areas? Perhaps. I will say honestly, I don't have enough information to confirm that. It makes sense theoretically. Obviously, if you're on the path of the eclipse, you can see it and experience it. But does it mean that astrologically it's going to be more relevant for you? Maybe. I'm still open to research that. But I think it is interesting, for those living in the United States. And if you want to learn more about, I put the website here, eclipsewise.com. There's another website that I really recommend that's going to give you a lot of information about eclipses. And that's called moonblink.info. Now, the way it works, I just plug in the day 2022, search, and it's giving me all the eclipses for the following years. It also gives me, what type of eclipse, if it's partial, total, hybrid. And then it also gives me the Saros number, which is something we're going to study more in depth on November 4th. So here you see the Saros series, and you can click on that. So the October 25th is a 124 Saros, and the following one is 136. The Saros cycle is a grouping, a family of eclipses. And you can see, if you click on it, all the eclipses that belong to that Saros number. So you see those that already occurred, they're kind of a darker background, and the ones that are yet to happen. And so you can relate those events, those dates, and see if in your life it means anything. The Saros eclipses are not necessarily happening at the same degree, but they do belong to the same family. And again, this is something we're going to need more time to explore. But I just want to now speak briefly about, because we're running out of time, the different types of eclipses and the orbs. So types of eclipse, you have a total eclipse, that's when it's really close to the nodes and they fully covered. Annular eclipse, that's when the moon is a little further away from the Earth in its cycle because its orbit is a little elliptical. So when the moon conjuncts the black moon Lilith, it's the furthest away from the Earth, and the moon is going to be slightly smaller. And as a reason, it won't cover the sun completely, and you kind of have a ring around the sun, kind of a ring of fire eclipse, they also call it. Partial eclipse is when it doesn't cover completely. Penumbral or a pulse eclipse is when the eclipse occurs in that range, the lighter gray range. So it's again a partial eclipse. So what are the orbs? Total eclipse for the sun, it can be total up to 10 degrees away from the nodes. It's still considered total. Whereas a lunar eclipse has a much tighter orb to be total. It has to be within 3.45 degrees from the nodes to be considered total. A partial eclipse, there's still kind of a range between partial and total, and then partial, and then possibly partial. So you see that solar eclipses have a much wider orb. Lunar eclipse, up to 18 and a half, and lunar up to 12 and a half. So something to keep in mind when you make your calculations. I just want to show you how it looks, for those who haven't seen that yet. So that's a solar eclipse. You see the Earth is facing the moon and the sun. How come that tiny moon can cover such a large sun? The magic of eclipses is that the moon and the sun appear to us visually, appear to us to be the same size exactly. And the reason is that the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, but the moon is 400 times closer to us. And so that exact ratio between size and distance creates this optic illusion that they're the same size. And that's why an eclipse can occur. And so the lunar eclipse is when the sun is in the, the Earth is in the middle between the moon and the sun. And so it's the Earth that blocks the light, and the moon is in the dark. So you can see lunar eclipses at night and solar eclipses during the day. And then the third option is when the sun is between the Earth and the moon, and that's the rapture. Sort of. So, that's what I was referring to, the 400 times. The magic of our time is that we are at the exact ratio between the moon and the sun, creating this optic illusion. However, the moon is moving gradually away from the Earth. And so as the moon keeps moving away, that's the last paragraph, as the moon is getting minutely farther from the Earth, about 4 centimeters every year, if we factor that into thousands of years, the moon is going to be too far at some point to create the eclipse effect. It's going to be too small. And so we're living now at a time where eclipses are possible. It's not going to happen forever. So, questions. We have 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Maurice. So wonderfully insightful. Yes, we do have nearly 500 people in here, so we'll try and get through a couple of questions here. Okay, let's go through.
So let's take 3 questions.
Okay, we've got one here. Is the effect of an eclipse total 6 weeks or 6 weeks before and after, for clarification? Thank you.
I would say, yeah, I would say a total of about 6 weeks. Not 6 weeks before and 6 weeks after. However, that's kind of the thick of the moment. That, you know, there are different degrees of intensity. So even, you know, 8 weeks or 10 weeks range, you can still have some, you know, some of the feelings, some of the activations.
Wonderful. Another question here. 3 planets are going direct in 1 month at the same time before the upcoming eclipse on the 25th. Is there any indication related to that? I'm not sure what part of the presentation they're referring to.
You know, it's basically we're in a time where there are a lot of retrogrades. We can look at that through our current chart now. The reason is, you know, planets that are opposite the sun are retrograde. So Mars will be retrograde because it's in the opposite hemisphere. Then Uranus and Jupiter and Neptune and all the slower moving planets are retrograde. So it's not immediately related to the eclipses. It's a separate phenomenon. But the fact that it seems like a lot of things are happening simultaneously the end of October, whether it's the retrograde, whether it's Mars, the Venus star point, the eclipses, it's like we're having, you know, some kind of a party at that time.
Wonderful, thank you. And there are a lot of burning questions. I might suggest maybe signing up for the workshop to bring your fantastic questions. So lastly, do you want to just reiterate about the workshop coming up on November 4th and how to sign up?
Well, it's on Kepler's website, but what I will just add one thing about these eclipses. As I mentioned, the lunar eclipse this year, the one that's going to happen on November 8th, as I said, involves Uranus and involves Mercury. So this can bring changes that really affect new discoveries, science, you know, important messages being revealed. There's something about communication, about knowledge, and about breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs that can be more relevant for that eclipse. Whereas the solar eclipse, which is again a more Venusian lunar quality, can bring matters that are more domestic, personal, emotional, relational. Both eclipses in Taurus Scorpio involves financial matters because it's the axis of resources and resource management. So it will be quite interesting to see whether this has to do with the election results, whether that will have to do with how Roe and Wade and the abortion right controversy is going to affect the elections in this Taurus Scorpio axis that has to do with body, that has to do with life and death. You know, we can definitely expect interesting development during the election. And so just wanted to point that out. And yes, November 4th, right before that next eclipse, you can go to the Kepler website. I think that's where you can sign up for it.